to yet another episode of Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl. Today, I have a good one for you. It's a record album that was released towards the end of World War II, but it has connections that go all the way back to the year 1300. It's actually quite the interesting story, if you happen to follow all the different paths that it seems to take through the maze of information. The records themselves may not be all that old, but the story more than makes up for it. So, I'm quite sure you'll enjoy this episode of Vinyl Tales. For today's topic, I thought I'd get back into my 78s and just see what I could find. The one that I chose for today isn't quite as old as the last 78 that I did, which was released in 1919. But the origins of the story reach all the way back to a region of northern Germany in the year 1300. But before I actually get into the story, I wanted to talk about the record album a little first. When you look this record album of 278 RPM records online, there are actually two versions of this album. The two versions, aside from the different catalog numbers, have one main difference. Recorded on April 24th, 1945, at the Symphony Hall in Boston by the Boston Symphony Orchestra and conducted by Sergei Koussevitzky, I have the two-record 78 RPM album called Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. For those of you that are unfamiliar, before RCA bought Victor Records and changed the name to RCA Victor, it was just Victor Records. It was originally founded as the Victor Talking Machine Company. Back in March 1903, Victor launched its sub-label, Victor Red Seal, as a special line to release what they considered to be the highest quality concert and operatic performances. Most people just summarize it and say that Red Seal records are reserved for classical type music. Now, I'm sure all record collectors like me are familiar with this Red Seal line, since in some way it actually survived well into the LP era and it didn't die out with the 78s. Eventually RCA bought Victor and the name was changed to what we're familiar with. Then later, in October 1945, RCA Victor changed the name of its sub-label to RCA Victor Red Seal Records, when it launched a short-lived series called Deluxe. This Red Seal Deluxe series lasted from October 1945 until May 1949. The 78s released in this series were made out of translucent red vinyl instead of shellac like other 78s. They also had two things on the front cover. The first is they all say deluxe edition, like this one does down here in the corner, printed somewhere on the front cover. Also, they all have the artist's bold autograph on the front as well. This one is right up here. This special series of 78s actually started with today's record, today's 78 album. Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, played by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, is the first release in this special Red Seal series. And I not only have it to show you, I have one that actually has first edition printed on the cover to verify that it's a first pressing. If you look, it says first edition right up here in the corner. This version on the red records, as you can see, red records, was released in October 1945. A few months later, in February 1946, it was reissued. And this one is the one that you might come across more often. This reissue was back on shellac just like other 78s. And it, of course, also had a different catalog number. This new number was to align with its spot in yet another series that RCA Victor also had going on at the time, called the Musical Masterpiece series. You go to look up this album online, and the two versions, the first being the RCA Victor Red Seal Deluxe Edition on red vinyl that I have here next to me, and the second release being the one from the Musical Masterpiece series on the just normal black shellac, just like most other 78s, are the only ones that were ever made. From what I can tell, from my digging, this performance, this recording in particular, was never reissued again, which actually is rather surprising, since the story behind it, the story behind the music, was so popular for a very long time. So stick with me a little longer, and I'll tell you just how long. Back in 1893, composer Richard Strauss, or Richard Strauss, made his first attempt at writing an opera. This attempt resulted in the composition Guntham. This opera's opening performance in Munich was a complete failure. And even though Strauss had been promised repeat performances, because of the failure of the first one, it was pulled from the schedule and not performed again. Because of the opera Guntham not doing very well, Strauss got pretty angry. In response, he decided to write another scornful opera about an anti-hero taking on the narrow-minded residents of a mythical medieval town called Schilda, based on Munich. The title was going to be Till Eulenspiegel and the Citizens of Schilda. In this opera, Till Eulenspiegel was to be a prankster who got sentenced to death, but in the end was instead made mayor of the town. Now, this opera never actually happened because Strauss dropped it to write a tone poem instead. A tone poem is pretty much what it sounds like. It's essentially a story, but in musical format. It takes a poem, a story, a painting, or another non-musical source, converts it into a piece of music, and that piece of music can then be played by an orchestra. An example of a tone poem that you might be familiar with is A Night on Bald Mountain. In 1895, 2 years after Guntram, Strauss debuted his new tone poem called Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks, after the old rogue's tale, set in rondo form for large orchestra. As long as that name is, if you pull the record out of this booklet here and you look on the actual label, it has that full name printed there. But most people just shorten it to Till Eulenspiegel's Merry Pranks. It's just easier to say. First performed in Cologne, Germany, and conducted by Franz Wöllner. Unlike his last composition, it was a big success. But being a tone poem, and not just a normal orchestral piece, that means that this music is based off of something. That something happens to be an old folk tale, and the oldest known publication is 1510. Till Eulenspiegel is an old European narrative protagonist from an old German chapbook, first published in 1510. However, there are also hints and things that reference earlier issues and earlier versions, but they have since been lost to time. So the earliest known publication is 1510. In these folk tales, he was a practical joker and a vagrant who traveled all around Europe and the Holy Roman Empire, but he was mainly in Germany. He would play pranks of a brutal, obscene, scatological, or farcical nature, and his jokes would depend on the use of puns. Basically, a very physical form of dad jokes. He would play these pranks as a way to get back at the society around him. He would target everyone, from the dishonest, condescending peasant, all the way up to the clergy and the nobility. There are even parts of these stories where Till is playing pranks on the Pope himself. But what would you think if I told you that this old German folk tale from 1510 was actually, potentially, based on a real person? According to the story told in the folktale, Till Eulenspiegel was born in a town in northern Germany called Neitlingen in the year 1300. He eventually leaves and travels as a vagrant, going all over Europe, causing chaos and trouble wherever he goes. He eventually finds his deathbed in the year 1350 at the hands of the bubonic plague. Even on his deathbed, he still finds the time to trick the priest who comes to visit him in his last hours. When you look at history itself to try to find Till as a real person, there is evidence to say so. In the Brunswick Register, a town in Germany, for the year 1339, there are references to a man named Till von Klettlinge, translated as Till from or of Neitlingen, the same town that this Till from the story was born in. In this register, he was in jail at the time. In the story, in 1339, he was also in jail at the time in Brunswick. Also, in the German city of Mjoln, where Till is said to have passed in the stories, there is a memorial stone that marks his place of burial. The inscription on the stone makes it clear for everyone to see that Till Eulenspiegel is who that stone is for. The stone that is currently there is one that was commissioned by the city in 1544 in order to replace a much older stone. This older stone was actually referenced in the original publishing of the story in that first quarter of the 1500s. Apparently, in 1591, a man named Finis Morrison traveled to Mjoln. When he got there, he wrote a sort of travel itinerary where he not only talked about his time in Mjoln, and he talked about this stone marker for Till Eulenspiegel, he also says that in that time, so late 1500s, the town also held a yearly festival in Till Eulenspiegel's honor. During this festival, they would display the clothes that Till Eulenspiegel was wearing at the time that he passed in 1350. And there you have it. This 2-record, 78 RPM album, originally released in October 1945 on red translucent vinyl, was written by Richard Strauss back in 1895. He started writing his story because he was mad at his previous score not having performed very well in the public's eyes, and he wanted to get back at him. But instead he changed his tune and decided to write a tone poem based on a very old German folk tale from the first part of the 1500s. This folk tale was based on the real-life events of an actual person who lived in the first half of the 14th century and ended up being a victim of the Black Death. Even though some of the events in the original story may have been either embellished or even added entirely to make the story a better read, the fact remains that it was a very well-liked story for a very long time. seeing as how even as recently as 2014, a movie was made based on the old German story. And in 2017, a book was written that placed Till in the 30 Years' War that took place in the early 17th century. You never know quite what you're going to find when you look up these records, especially when you start digging into the 78s. Since they're older stuff, they have to have an older reference for their creation. Honestly, I just saw this one sitting there and I thought it looked interesting, so I figured I'd look it up and see what it was about. I didn't expect to go back 650, 700 years. But that just goes to show you everything's got a story if you're willing to look. If you have any other stories, any other cool facts, let me know. I will look into them. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, my name is Brandon. This has been Vinyl Tales, where we spin tales about vinyl. And I will see you later.